So let's start with you introducing yourself as well as Afford. If you could just tell me briefly about yourself and your organization as we move deeper into the conversation, that would be very helpful.
Okay, my name is Onyekachi Wambu. I'm the Executive Director of the African Foundation for Development. Afford is a charity that has been around, formed in 1994 to enhance and expand the contributions that Africans in the diaspora make to Africa's development. We're currently we see those contributions as fivefold: the financial, intellectual and knowledge and social capital that the diaspora deploy, as well as the political capital that the diaspora deploy, and then finally the cultural capital. In that cultural space, we have a program called Return of the Icons, where we're trying to look at the issues surrounding restitution and make the case for African looted artifacts and human remains to be returned to the continent.
Yeah, yes, I read your report, which you launched in June 2020, The Return of the Icons, and I found it extremely useful. Could you share with us, what you found to be really best practice, at least with regard to the UK, institutions, as well as the diaspora, and why this becomes really an imperative for the world, the return of the icons?
I think the icons are part of a broader decolonization agenda. There are a lot of issues that are unresolved out of that colonial period, and there are issues of reparations, there are issues of restitution of these pieces, of these artifacts, and human remains. We have to remember that there are lots of human remains in these collections. And so it's part of that broader decolonial agenda. These issues were raised in the last 2 to 3 years as part of the Black Lives Matter. We saw statues come down, and people want a real sort of reassessment of that past. And for, we've had one version of that past in terms of that history, which is the history of the powers who were in the ascendancy and were able to impose the colonial order. I think now there's a real demand as part of this decolonial agenda to deconstruct, to hear the voices of the victims of that period and whose voices haven't been heard. So I see this restitution agenda as being part of that. In terms of best practice, I've likened what's going on in this whole space to the kinds of, people talk about when you're trying to deal with an issue, they talk about, the stages of grief. So the first stage usually is denial. The second stage is frustration and anger, and then you go all the way through to the final stage, which is acceptance, and then trying to do the right thing. So I would say that in the UK in particular, that we're going through all those different stages of grief with different people. So there are some institutions that are at the stage of acceptance, and they recognize the arguments for equity, for justice, to have these items returned. And then you have others who are still in the anger phase and the rejection phase, and they don't want to hear it, and they think it's an attack on British history. They think it's a bit of the woke culture trying to rewrite British history, rather than actually looking at the really substantive arguments that have been made by Africans and people of African descent as to why these items are really important to them and why they should go back.
And why are they important to them? I mean, there are people who say, well, I mean, these things happened a long time ago. We don't need to revisit that. I mean, we can kind of adapt to the status quo and make the best of it.
Well, I think the question is, if these things don't matter, why have the British and the Europeans and other Europeans hung on to them for so long? I mean, of course they matter. The British, in the museums, the argument is made that, Britain is displaying the world to itself. Africa needs to have its sense of itself as well, and to display its own treasures in its own spaces. And now there's a big debate about whether the current Western idea of a museum is the best way to display these items if they were returned. And that's a conversation we can have amongst ourselves. Many of these items were functional, they were ritual objects. So is a museum the best place to display them anyway? So that's when they're returned. So that's a big conversation we can have. But there's no doubt about the importance of these cultural items. They're an example of our genius. If you look at the treasures from the Benin bronzes, from the Ashanti gold pieces, the Egyptian, the Pharaonic pieces, the Ethiopian pieces from the Magdala. I mean, these are world defining aesthetic and artistic triumphs, and Africa needs to have that as well to reconnect to its past and to begin to understand how young Africans can be inspired by this, can react to it, but can see it as part of how they begin, as the AU wants by 2063, to recreate an African Renaissance. And if you don't have the Naissance, how can you have a Renaissance? And the Naissance are in these pieces.
Absolutely. So let's move on to an area of immense interest to me, because I know you've been working in this area, which is really the whole question of the responsibility of institutions in the global north. And, in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, as well as other, advocacy work that can be done in the global north. How do you, how would you say is the responsibility of institutions in Europe and the United States, researchers as well as the media, to facilitate restitution, and also to amplify, the voices of those of us who are based on the continent?
As I said, I mean, when I talked about the stages of grief, different people are at different stages. The Germans, I mean, they have a tradition of having to deal with a painful history and to make restitution, as they have been doing to the Jewish people. So they've been able to come very quickly to conclusions about these items in German museums, and they made a commitment to return them. And now the process that is unfolding is, what are these pieces? Because a lot of these pieces are in basements, they are not catalogued. So there's a process of, first of all, understanding, what these pieces are, who they belong to, the human remains that are, as I said, in boxes that were part of studies that were done, and part of that whole period of, when there were, cataloging different human beings around the planet as part of a kind of, white supremacy project. And so what you have are bones, and you don't know, nobody has filed those properly. So there's a whole thing that even the Germans who want to move ahead are having to cope with, and we need to work with them with that, and many of us are beginning to work with them on that. And then you have other institutions like the British Museum and the National Collections in the UK, where there's a law in place, the 1963 Museum Act, that forbids basically breaking up the collections. There's some very find grounds on which they can do it, but at the moment they argue that the law stops them from doing this. So if you're going to have any movement with those national collections, the law needs to be changed. It has been changed in the past and amended, but only in relation to Nazi looted artifacts that may be in the national collection. And now there is the amendment to the law means that if there's any Nazi looted artifacts, they should be returned to their owners. So you can see that there's a pathway for trying to return the law because there's been a precedent. But that's going to take some time. We're living in a political context, and in the UK Parliament at the moment, there's perhaps a 79, 80 seat majority for a party that is not interested in, a woke agenda, so to speak. So that's going to take time. But there are other museums in the UK that are not bound by the law. So the regional museums in Glasgow, in Birmingham, etc., that can begin a voluntary process. And some of them have risen to that challenge. Other institutions, there was a university in Scotland that recently returned a Benin bronze. Others are now just doing this because it's between them and their board of trustees of those institutions. And once the board of trustees are convinced, they make the restitution. And the same thing happened with Jesus College in Cambridge that returned a cockerel, another Benin bronze, recently. So, as I said, there's a continuum, and different people are doing different things. But the first thing we think that needs to happen, and resources need to be provided for this, is that we need to know what is there, and we need to know who the material belongs to, who the artifacts belong to, who the human remains belong to. So there's a process of auditing, and there's a process of cataloguing that needs to be done first. And whether the museums are bound by the 63 Act in the UK or they're not, that process needs to happen so that we know what's in there. And the museums will tell you that what's on display is a fraction of the collections that they have. And there's a lot of stuff in basements and in boxes that we simply don't know, and they don't know what they are. And that work needs to be done.
Now, in your assessment, do you think there are certain products that are easier to return than others? I mean, for instance, if you look at the return of our ancestors who are in Europe and the United States, vis-a-vis the return of the artifacts and so on, is there a difference in terms of the willingness to return, and if so, why?
Well, obviously the very emotional area is the ancestral remains, our ancestors, as we say, who are in these institutions, and the law on there has, there's been a lot of movement in the last 20, 30 years on there, and there is a law in place that, has created the conditions for those returns. And most institutions now are very, have begun processes for return. But at the same time, you have this ambivalent and strange response to ancestral remains, which is that, the current legislation only impacts ancestral remains that are, less than 1,000 years old. Anything more is not, I don't know, you somehow, if you're more than 1,000 years old, you cease to be human in some strange way, according to this legislation. So what you then find is that, for instance, our high-ranking officials and pharaohs and kings who are more than 1,000 years old in these collections are still on display. you go to the British Museum, there's a mummy hall that displays human remains, ancestral remains. And that's something that we are now really pushing for this to stop, and for people to be given their dignity in death, so that they're not gawped at on a Sunday afternoon by a family traipsing through the British Museum. And, you know, when the pharaohs and others built their monuments, it was for other purposes. You know, they built these incredible pyramids and everything else, and they housed it with the amazing treasures that people have taken out. But, you know, their purpose was very clear. It wasn't to be stared at by people. It was for another spiritual journey in the afterlife, when they were going to have, you know, in the stars. And so even if it was just on the basis of respecting their wishes, and you know, putting them on display, I just think it's disgraceful.
Absolutely. I know you have a very busy schedule today. I just wanted to ask you one last question. So a few of us on the continent are really committed to ensuring that restitution of cultural heritage actually does happen. Do you see any partnerships that could be established between those of us who are located on the continent and those of you who are located in the diaspora? And how would that look like?
Well, our organization is about partnerships with the continent. We think that the diaspora is an arm of the continent. I mean, the AU now talks about the diaspora as a sixth region, and you know, since '94, we've been doing that before the AU announced the sixth region. So, you know, when we make our remittances and everything else, there is a commitment and there's a partnership with people at home. You know, that remittance economy is about over $80 billion a year. So you can see that people are making huge sacrifices sometimes to maintain the partnerships on a personal level with their relatives. But now we're thinking, how do we do this strategically? How do we work in partnership with civil society organizations, with African governments, to really, you know, harness those diaspora resources? So the partnership is a must. I mean, the pieces are going to come back. We see ourselves here as, you know, looking after these pieces. You know, we are the relatives of the people who are in boxes, you know, the ancestral remains. We are the ones who are emotionally connected in lots of deeper ways to the artifacts. I'm an Igbo from Nigeria, and when I go to the British Museum, I can see artifacts from the Ibuku excavations, the bronze pieces, and those affect me in a very emotional way. I mean, in a very different way than anybody else just walking into the museum, because, you know, there's a portrait there of a bronze portrait with a man with a scarification, which is how our titled individuals used to display themselves in the past, you know, before Christianity and colonial period. And then you look at that bronze, and it can be traced back to around 950 AD. So this is probably the first portrait of an Igbo person that exists. So for me, that's a very emotional thing that I see, that's being captured and represented in that way. And so so for us, we've kept track of it. And the partnership now is to return it, to then have the conversations to see, what does that portrait mean? For me as an Igbo person, it actually inspired me to write a piece of creative fiction about the first and the last Igbo person. And if the bronze is the first, then the last may be somebody that is, you know, an AI figure, a robotic individual in 2,000, 3,000 years old after we've learned how to download consciousness onto a disk. So what does Igbo consciousness look like in 2,000 years? So these are the things that these pieces are going to inspire us to begin to not only look to the past, but imagine where we're going to go. And that partnership with the continent and with our governments, who have not been as, I would say, as forceful as demanding their patrimony back. That partnership with civil societies, definitely in Africa, is a powerful thing that we should make sure that it happens. And I don't mean in terms of slogans, but I mean in terms of real work.
Absolutely, and you do touch a very interesting area here with regard to the ways in which our past can inspire innovation and technology and so on, and spark creativity. With regard, for example, to bringing the past to the present through technology and artificial intelligence and so on, and science fiction and all sorts of things. So this is not just a sentimental, relationship with our past, but actually a very concrete relationship, something that could spur us. Yeah.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you look at that bronze again in 950 AD, I mean, it was technologically at the cutting edge. We've now lost being at the cutting edge in so much in Africa, but there was a time when, we were able to compete globally with everybody else. And I again, as I said, I wrote a piece of fiction about it, but what I was thinking about was, well, why did the person who funded that piece and brought together, the metal workers to fashion it and the investment to do that? Why did he do it at a time when others were not doing it? And then what he has done as a part of is to then leave a mark in time. And we're not leaving marks in time because we're not doing what he did in 950 AD, and bringing together the best of the skilled artisans, the craftspeople, the metal workers, and others to design responses to our future.
So, Onyekachi, Wambu, I really want to thank you very much, my brother, for really creating time to talk with me today. We are discussing decolonization and restoration of cultural heritage in Africa. And I know you're doing amazing work. We will definitely be following up on the work that you're doing and exploring ways in which we can actually work together. So I really want to thank you very much for the opportunity to engage.
Thank you. And just one final thing. The return of the icons. The icons are individuals from our history, that iconic figures. They are iconic pieces from our histories, and we want them to return and then there are also ideas from our history, and we want to be in conversation again with our history. So return of the icons is really about returning all of that into our daily conversations and our daily calculations and our daily artistic and other responses. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this today.
Thank you very much, my brother. Thank you.